this for people who miss it. Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I hope you're all doing well and you're taking care of yourselves. I know this has been a stressful couple of weeks. We have a really awesome speaker lineup coming up, so make sure to take a look at the calendar. We have kind of had back-to-back lectures. Next week, we have another one, which is going to be really cool, by Guillermo Garcia Perez, and he'll be talking about emergent spatial entanglement in many body quantum systems. So that's going to be kind of a shift from the talks that we've had, but he's a really interesting and cool person. So make sure to come to that. I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping rules and norms. This is meant to be a pretty informal seminar series, and so I just sort of encourage you all to be kind to one another and nice, and ask lots of questions. So during the Q&A, you don't have to just ask questions about the content of the science, but also there are a lot of graduate students here, and Casey's sort of an expert on sort of giving advice about life in academia. And so be sure to ask sort of questions about that as well. Just so you know, this is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recorded while you're asking questions during the Q&A, you can turn your camera off and stay muted, and you can write a question into the chat and I can read it aloud for you. But feel free to also speak aloud during the Q&A. We love to see your faces and hear your voices as well. That being said, make sure to stay muted while the talk is going on, and yeah, and be nice. So, okay. Thank you all for being here. So it's a really big honor today to be introducing Casey Feissler. She's an assistant professor and a founding faculty member in information science at the University of Colorado Boulder. She has this really awesome new YouTube channel, which I've been following a bit, and it gives a lot of really cool advice about academic life and tech ethics. And for all the young researchers out there, I think it's a really good resource, so make sure to check it out. She also has this really, really fun book club that I've been following. It's really fun. It's on speculative ethics, and it's a lot of really cool sci-fi, and I love that. So check that out if you're interested in that too. But yeah, so generally she's just sort of a hero all around in science, and so we're really lucky to have her here today. And she'll be talking about ethics and data science. And yeah, so Casey, I'll just let you take it away.
Great, thank you. Hold on, I need to get rid of this meeting is being recorded pop-up. There we go. Hi, thank you for that very kind introduction. So I have this sort of first slide as a list of some things that I do in my research, partly because I won't be talking about all of these things. So if there's any of this that intrigues you, feel free to ask me about it as well. But what I am going to talk about are some ethical controversies that are related to tech and some to data science specifically, and a couple of studies that are specifically about collecting data from the internet, featuring my research ethics soapbox and my ethics education soapbox. So let's start with a hopefully simple question. What is ethics for a researcher? So this is actually a really hard question to answer, but I can give you a wrong answer. And the wrong answer is that it's what the IRB tells you that you can do. If you have not heard the term IRB before, it stands for Institutional Review Board, which is the essentially a research ethics governing body at US universities. that receive federal funding, which is like most of them. So, for a really long time, if you talked about research ethics to an academic at all, this is immediately what they're thinking of. Oh, research ethics. That means that like, I have to tell the IRB what I'm going to do, and then I have to get informed consent, and it's a big hassle, et cetera, et cetera. So the thing about IRBs, though, is that they are specifically concerned with human subjects research. And the reason they exist is because like decades and decades ago, there were some very, very unethical experiments, and it was, determined that, oh, there needs to be some regulation of this. And so it's actually codified in law what these governing bodies deal with, which is human subjects, which means either that you're directly interacting with people and or you're collecting identifiable private information. And by that, they mean things like names and, that email addresses, that kind of thing. So the issue here is that there's a lot of types of research that are happening now that do not fall under that definition. Kinds of data being collected, for example, that you wouldn't think of the same way that you think of, oh, I'm going to interview people, or I'm going to survey people, or I'm going to bring people into a lab and do an experiment. But instead, it's just like, I'm going to scrape 1 million tweets or YouTube videos or Tinder profile photos. And so for a while now, and I would say that in particular in the past 5, 6, 7 years, there has been more attention to, oh, maybe we should also be thinking about the ethics of this kind of thing. And so this is a large part of what I'm talking about today, is when we are collecting and analyzing using data that comes from people, but without direct interaction with people. And for a number of years now, I guess 5 or 6, I've been organizing workshops at various computer science conferences about research ethics, and in particular with this issue of public data. I don't expect you to absorb this slide. It's more like the point of the slide is that there are open questions in this space, and every single time I've run one of these workshops, we end with the exact same open question. So they're not getting closed. And one of the reasons for this is that there aren't a lot of strong social norms in at least the sort of computer science HCI research community for this kind of thing. I think we are getting there. There are more norms now than there were, say, 5 years ago. And part of the reason is because we're talking about it more. I think that people sometimes shy away from talking about ethical considerations in their papers, for example, even if they had some, because they're like, well, I don't want to draw attention to it. Like, what if someone tells me that I did the wrong thing? So I think that having more open conversations about some of these tricky ethical things is really helpful for the research community. Okay, so when I ask people whether it's, how do you decide whether you can collect data from something? I usually get one of these 2 answers. That the things you have to decide are, you have to think about the terms of service, and you also have to think about whether the data is public. So this first one, I was interested in this topic of terms of service because, like, one of those open questions for a really long time is like, are researchers allowed to violate terms of service in order to collect data? I'm guessing that there's at least one person in here right now who has wondered this before. And this came up for me when I was still a graduate student. So I did my PhD at Georgia Tech in Atlanta, and I don't know if any of you remember Yik Yak, RIP Yik Yak, right? But it was this really interesting anonymous app that was like geofenced to universities. And so it was very popular at Georgia Tech because Yik Yak was based in Atlanta, and it was one of the first places that it was released. Anyway, we wanted to study it. And I was the buzzkill lawyer who read the terms of service and was like, hey, so it says that you can't scrape the data from Yik Yak. And so my advisor asked them for permission and they said no. And then a bunch of people wrote papers with scraped Yik Yak data anyway. And you know, I've because I hear that so often, like, well, you need to look at the terms of service. And my initial thought was always like, well, but is that an ethical, like, is that what you need to be making an ethical decision? And so to think about that, I wanted to know what these terms actually say. And so with some of my colleagues, we collected the data collection provisions from the terms of service from over 100 different social media sites. And again, I do not expect you to absorb this table. And also I'm not, you know, this is probably out of date for a lot of these now too, but the point is vastly inconsistent. The letters here, these are essentially different categories of types of data scraping provisions, whether it prohibits just automated data collection, any data collection, whether there's whether it's something specific about private data, et cetera. But the takeaway from this is that these provisions are super vague and highly inconsistent across sites. And I've also done some work on other parts of terms of service. I've looked at copyright licenses, I've looked at harassment rules, and this highly inconsistent and incredibly vague is basically true for everything. But here's the big takeaway from this. Most of these data collection provisions are completely context agnostic. Like, it doesn't matter what data you're collecting, it doesn't matter what the expectations of the users are, who you are, what you're going to do with it. None of these things matter. All it says is like, don't scrape data or something like that. And so the point of this is that if you're making a decision based on terms of service, so like, you know, if the terms of service says I can't scrape data, I'm not going to scrape data. If they don't say that, I will scrape data. So this assumes that A, violating terms of service is inherently unethical, which I don't think is true. And then even more problematic, that violating terms of service is the only thing that can make data collection unethical. So this first one came to mind to me actually a couple of days ago because I looked at the terms of service for Parler. So lots of researchers are interested in Parler now because apparently, which is the new social media site that is intended to be to not be biased towards liberals as Facebook and Twitter are being accused of being. And their terms of service has a data collection provision that says that you can't do anything that would be contrary to the interests of Parler. And that actually made me wonder, like, could they enforce that in terms of like, you can't collect data from our website if your findings are going to be unfavorable towards us or make us look bad? If I don't know if that's how that's intended, but if it were true, you could actually argue that like violating that kind of term could be ethical. And there's also been a recent lawsuit with the ACLU and Christian Sandvig and some other researchers about violating terms of service for the specific reason of rooting out discrimination. So like violating terms of service by creating fake accounts on housing websites in order to audit their algorithm. And then the second part, that violating terms of service is the only thing that can make data collection unethical, which I definitely don't think is true. And so let's talk a little more about that. So this, so the second thing that you hear a lot is, well, you can collect data if it is public. And you know, we could get into like what constitutes definitions of public, et cetera. So here's one of my favorite examples. So a researcher spoofed a logged in account and scraped all of OkCupid, which is a dating site, and created a database of all of it, and then just put it on the internet without any anonymization. If you've never used OkCupid, the way that it works is that it matches people based on answering a very large number of user-generated questions, and that's how their match algorithm works. And so let's just say that this data set had some answers to some very, very personal questions in it, tied to usernames, locations, lots of things that you could use to identify people. And when the researcher was called out on this, the response was, well, the data is already public. And this is not a new kind of statement. One of my collaborators, Michael Zimmer, wrote a paper in 2010 about Facebook, because this was the exact same, actually almost the exact same wording. It is. When some researchers who were collecting data from Facebook were accused of the same thing. In fact, Michael has a Google alert for this phrase, just in case. So this is a common kind of thing that we hear. And as a result of this, whoa, you need public data. And public, means that well, you can see it. It wouldn't, typically the definition of public doesn't mean tricking someone into friending you on Facebook so you can see it. So Facebook friends only posts would not be considered public. And of course, where do we have a whole lot of public data? Twitter. There's a paper from Zeynep Tufekci where she calls Twitter the fruit fly of social computing research, that it has the model organism problem. It just like biologists study fruit flies, not because fruit flies are so representative of other kinds of things, but they're so easy to study because their life cycles are so fast. That's why fruit flies are studied, because they have these really short life cycles. You can do lots of stuff with them really fast, and it's easy to study. Same thing with Twitter. It's just the easiest thing to study. They've got this API, it's so easy to collect data from Twitter. And this is why we have all of these papers. And I'm not just talking about computer science. I bet you could take any field and find a paper where they have studied Twitter data. Whether it's people live tweeting a TV show, or can we predict who's going to win the presidential election, or, so much on Twitter. And so my collaborator, Nick Preferis, and I wanted to find out, how did Twitter users actually feel about this? Do they think it's ethical? Are they bothered? And most importantly, what kinds of contextual factors might influence how they feel about it? So this is a study that was published in Social Media and Society a couple of years ago. Oh, and I won't go into the methods. It was a survey to save time. But here's the takeaways. 61% of people had no idea that researchers use tweets in research at all. And also, for those of you who are thinking closely about this, you might have already thought about an inherent type of bias that was in this study, which is that, Casey, people who agreed to participate in your survey about how people feel about research might have slightly different opinions about research than people who don't want to participate in a survey, in a research study, which is completely true. And actually, when Nick and I were doing this, we're there's a good chance that we do this survey and everyone's just yeah, research is fine. We love research. And we're if that's the case, then we'll just call it a wash and won't publish it. So I actually suspect that the findings I'm going to show you here, it's actually worse than this. I suspect that people who, were willing to participate in a survey might actually have more awareness of research than sort of the average Twitter user. That's just speculation, though. Also, almost half thought that this is clearly not allowed. Researchers definitely aren't allowed to do this without permission. They must be breaking some kind of rule. And we also ask people, regardless of what you think about your tweets specifically, do you think that researchers should be able to use tweets in research without permission? And most people said no, though a lot did offer caveats. So like, well, I'd want to know what the purpose of the research is, or I'd want to be told about it. Or, it makes a difference if it's like a large scale study versus me being, in this small scale study. And there was lots of this as well. I mean, I think the point about informed is really interesting. Actually, 85% of our survey participants said that if their tweet was used in a research paper, they would want to read the paper. And how often does research ever get, so even in human subjects research, I think it's pretty rare to share the findings back with the people you studied. I do that when I do a survey or interviews. I will optionally allow participants to give me their email address if they want to, save that separately from the data. And then when the paper's published, send them a copy of it. A lot of people don't even do that, but you definitely, people really aren't doing it when it comes to Twitter. It's not like you're tracking down, the people from the million tweets that you studied. So, there could be this way though to break apart inform and consent. Like there were more people saying, "Oh, I just want to know," than were saying, "I want you to ask me permission." Another chart that you can't really absorb, but the point of this is that we ask people about contextual factors, like, how comfortable would you be with this if, it were humans analyzing your tweets versus just a computer, if it was, deleted content, if it was, part of lots of tweets or a few, etc. And the point of this is that these things mattered. And some of them you could probably guess, like people were very, very uncomfortable with deleted tweets being used, which is actually one of those open questions, because deleted content is being studied, and arguably like that is different than content that is still there, etc. So the point of all of this is there are things that matter when it comes to people's comfort levels with their content being used. Things like what kind of data you're collecting, what you're going to do with it, who you are, and what the expectations and norms of the users are. The same kinds of things that, for example, are not included in terms of service. So if I could leave you with one thing to take out of this talk and climb onto my soapbox with me, publicness is not the only context that matters when it comes to making decisions about whether it's ethical to collect data or how you should be collecting data. Because the point of the study was not, we're going to tell people whether they can use tweets in research or not. It was, we know people are using tweets in research. What kinds of guidance could we give them about the kinds of things that they should be thinking about in order to do it most ethically? So here's a concrete example of one of these kinds of things. So there was a study a couple of years ago where they were looking at articles in PubMed that use Twitter data. So these are health and medical related studies. 72% of the studies that use Twitter data quoted directly at least one tweet, which led back to the Twitter user 84% of the time. And these are medical, health-related studies. There's actually a ton of health-related research that takes place on Twitter. Lots of public health-related stuff, like everything from, can we figure out where the flu is going to go next, to can we identify people who are suicidal? So the idea here, in part, is that this tweet about what someone ate for breakfast, and I just found this by putting breakfast into Twitter when I first made these slides a few years ago. This tweet is not equivalent to a tweet where someone is revealing their HIV status. And if your only heuristic for how you're going to treat data is it public or not, these two things are equivalent, right? And you should treat them exactly the same. But I don't even want to put the exact tweet of the second one on the slide. There's no reason I need to do that. I can paraphrase it and you get the point, right? there was this was a few years ago now, maybe it's still when I was in grad school, it's probably 5 or 6 years ago now. A New York Times reporter was writing a story about a paper that used Twitter data. And the topic of the story was like really innocuous. It was like, what happens to people's language on Twitter after they get engaged or something like that. But the reporter found the code book in the paper. Like, so there was a code book that was like, here's how we analyze the data, and here's a tweet that's an example of this thing, et cetera. And she searched for the tweets in Twitter and found them and contacted the people who had tweeted them and was like, hey, your tweet was part of this research study. Can we talk about it? No harm done, right? Like, again, a very innocuous subject matter. But this made me think that what if the subject matter instead had been types of papers that I've seen that use Twitter data before. So for example, something about public health that might have a tweet about someone's HIV status, or we're seeing a lot more like predictive machine learning work that's using social media data. So what if, for example, the paper was, here's a code book that shows how our algorithm classified tweets for mental health conditions. So here is someone, here's an example of a tweet from someone that our algorithm said was severely depressed versus mildly depressed. And then imagine someone says, hey, so an algorithm says you're depressed. You could see how that would actually be quite harmful. And so obviously the content matters, but another thing is that the people who are creating content and sharing it are in different types of positions in terms of vulnerability. So one of my graduate students, Brianna Dim, interviewed people in fandom communities, which is essentially a proxy for LGBTQ online communities, about how they felt about data being used by both researchers and journalists. And they talked about situations like about how they might be out in an online community, but not in their real life. And so if something about them got amplified beyond the context where it was intended, and there was something to tie it to their real identity, potentially, an example someone gave us was like, I draw art on Tumblr. What if like it was in BuzzFeed and someone recognized my art style and then it led them back to my Tumblr where I'm out? That this could have real safety concerns. And another concern they had was that, researchers are they're just taking stuff from our community. They're just like parachuting in and taking our stuff, and analyzing us, and it just feels weird. One of my graduate students right now, Shamika Goddard, is basically replicating this study with Black Twitter. She's talking to people who participate in Black Twitter about how they feel about researchers. And honestly, like, this kind of concern is a big one. Like, oh, so wait, you mean like some white researchers could come in and just like take our data and analyze it without us and like write a paper about it? Because most of our participants hadn't really thought about that, but they had noticed this happening with journalists and with like people like taking memes from the community and like sharing it in other places, and not, like the culture vultures, they called it, like a sort of appropriation kind of thing. And so this is something that could happen in research too. And also, what you're going to do with the data matters. So imagine, that data is taken from your community to create technology that could be actively harmful. The example here of using videos from YouTube of people going through gender transition in order to train facial recognition. Like, people are putting themselves in a very vulnerable position to make these videos to help their community. And their content is being taken and used to create technology that could identify transgender people, which could be very harmful. And of course, this is nothing new. Like, Research can be used in negative ways. So for example, this paper that from 2013 that showed that Facebook likes can are very predictive of personality traits, and they wrote in the paper that like, oh, there's some pretty bad things that people could do with this, and then they did. And you know, a lot of people thought about Cambridge Analytica as like a privacy scandal, but it was also a research ethics scandal. You could think about that original research and how it might have inspired this. I don't know if we know that for sure. But also in Cambridge Analytica, like people were told that their data was being used for one thing and then it was used for something else. You know, even the people who originally filled out the personality test, et cetera, they were told that was for science. If they were told like, oh, actually, you know, we're going to build models of like personality for Facebook data, and so that political campaigns can use it to manipulate you, like we probably would not have participated in that research. But this is happening with public data all the time. And here's, you know, one of my other favorite examples of negative consequences of technology. So Zoom bombing, which of course does not have to do with data science. But the reason that this example I find quite compelling is that when all of this started happening in the spring, Zoom bombing was like hitting the news. Everyone was, Zoom bombing, like this is really bad. The CEO of Zoom did an interview with the New York Times where he said, well, you know, we hadn't thought about that. Like it didn't, we didn't think about how people might misuse this technology. And I was thinking like, I don't know, I feel like, you know, I feel like if someone had said, how might, like, here are the features of Zoom. Like, here's what the default privacy settings are. And, you know, there's an 8, you know, whatever number of digit, you know, code for the rooms. And like, what do you think bad people might do with this technology? Like, I don't know this for sure, of course, but I feel like I probably could have come up with like, oh, people are going to pop into Zoom meetings and like scream racial slurs and show people their genitals. Like, I think that someone could have come up with that. So I've been thinking about unintended consequences a lot lately, or unanticipated sometimes is a better word. And this is something that's been coming up a lot in the HCI community over the past few years. And there are lots of different ways that you can think about this, right? So like, you're doing research or you're building technology, and what kinds of things might happen. There are consequences for individuals, for entire communities, even for like science. Like if you're doing unethical research, it can undermine trust in science, which is actually a huge thing. Society, like, you know, I sort of always joke that like when Mark Zuckerberg was building Facebook to like rank the hottest girls at Harvard, you know, it probably wasn't anticipated that someday it would be so embedded in the social fabric of society that it could like influence democracy. But at some point along the way, maybe that became a little more clear, right? And also bad actors, unanticipated uses, right? So like, if you're a user experience designer and you're coming up with personas for how people are going to use your system, and you're like, so that you can make it better for them to use. Like you should also have personas that are like racist user, abusive ex-partner stalker user, and user who thinks it's funny to show people all their genitals. Like those are also user personas you should be thinking about, and then designing against them. Like, how can we change the privacy setting defaults in Zoom so that it's harder for people to do those things? So some of you might be aware of this concept of technical debt, which is this idea that, you know, there's probably going to be some bugs in this thing that you're making. But, you know, we got to move fast and break things. Like, got to get something out, got to release it. And it's okay if there's a few bugs, because like you can fix them later, right? You know, that one form isn't going to work. It's fine. You can do a patch. And, you know, fixing it later is going to be a little bit harder than it would be to fix now, but you got to get it out. So you're accruing this debt that's going to have to be repaid later when you fix the bugs. So if we're thinking about ethical debt instead, it's the same kind of thing. It's this implied cost of not thinking about the potential harms now, assuming that you can fix them later once you find out. So like, you know, I'm building a new social platform, and I don't know how this might impact democracy in 5 years, or what kinds of privacy violations people, but you know, we'll find out eventually, because once we put it in the world, we'll see what those bugs are. These are different kinds of bugs, right? Like the people who are Zoom bombed cannot unsee what happened there, right? So I've been thinking about this a lot with one of my PhD students, Natalie Garrett, and we wrote this op-ed for Wired recently, if you're interested in reading more about this concept. So then comes the question, like, okay, so like, Casey, we got it, like, that we are convinced this is a problem. What do we do about it? So
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
My phone's talking to me. So, you know, thinking back to Cambridge Analytica, a former Google engineer wrote this op-ed at the time that was like, we have an ethics crisis in computer science, and Cambridge Analytica is a good example. And he said this thing that really resonated with me, and it was that software engineers continue to treat safety and ethics as specialties rather than the foundations of all design. And I saw that and I thought, oh, yeah, okay, that explains everything that is wrong with computer science education. And so I wrote this op-ed at the time, where my clickbaity tagline here is that if you work in tech and you're not thinking about ethics, you're bad at your job. So I think that one reason that ethics gets treated as a specialization a lot of the times, which is basically this idea of like, well, I'm just the engineer. And how many times I've heard variations of I'm just the engineer is a lot, right? I think we get that attitude in part because that is largely how ethics is taught, if it's taught at all. I mean, that's a whole other issue. Though I will say that in the United States, in order to be accredited, computer science programs do have to teach some vague sense of professional responsibility and ethics, et cetera. But it's most often in standalone classes in terms of required content. I think this might be shifting a bit, but I certainly, you know, I taught the required computer science ethics class at Georgia Tech, which was your senior year. At the very end, you know, the one computer science ethics class, and their students were unhappy by the time they got there because they'd been writing nothing but code for at least a year by then. And also they just spent 3 years learning how to be a computer scientist. And now you're telling us there's all this other stuff we're supposed to be thinking about. So I also looked specifically at AI, machine learning, and data science classes a couple of years ago. So we looked at the syllabi, and if syllabi were not available, course descriptions of all of these types of classes in the top 20 CS programs in the US, according to US News and World Report. I definitely don't expect you to understand what this table is saying, but here's the takeaway. Only 12% of technical courses included any mention of like ethics, privacy. And we were being very generous. We're like, oh, differential privacy is in there somewhere. Like that's, you know, that counts. There were, you know, some standalone AI ethics classes in here as well, but for the like technical classes, very little mention of this. And this is like, arguably things like AI, ML, and data science are sort of the, you know, the obvious kinds of classes for where ethics is relevant. We also did an analysis of a bunch of different AI classes, and I bring up the title of this paper because my favorite part of this was one of the syllabi had ethics listed at the very end and said, "If time allows." If we manage to cover everything else in the class, then maybe we'll talk about ethics at the very end. We've actually known for a long time that integrating ethics in across the curriculum is better than just having it in a standalone class. So in the mid 90s, the NSF funded a task force to like figure out how to teach ethics. Like, did you know that like people weren't talking about this much then? But they came to the conclusion that ideally it should be in every class and also a standalone class. But if you had to choose one, then integrated into every class is better than standalone classes. And they wrote an article in Communications of the ACM about this. And then in the next issue, there was this letter to the editor written by like the dean of a computer science department that was basically like, this is not computer science. I can't imagine a computer scientist teaching these things. Discussing ethics is not doing computer science. And I still hear a little bit of this today. I'd like to think that it's a little bit better, but you know, if we're not teaching, you know, oh, you're learning how to do machine learning. Well, guess what? Part of doing it well is making sure that your output isn't biased and not like, oh, we're going to teach you later that like maybe you should think about these things. Because if we teach it as like it's a specialty, then you get this idea that like, well, there's someone whose job it is to think about this. Like, I'm a machine learning specialist. The ethics specialist has to think about the ethics. So these are some of the reasons why I think this is important. It emphasizes that ethics is part of technical practice. It avoids isolating it from its context. And it ensures that everyone who's taking a technical class is exposed to ethics content. Because a lot of people take one programming class and don't do any more, but you can do a lot of damage with a little bit of code, right? I always feel like I can't make this argument without giving you some ideas. so these are some things that I've thought about and some things that I do myself. So, you know, one argument I hear is like, well, students don't care. Like the students in my ML class don't care about ethics. I don't know. I don't buy that. Like there's a tech ethics controversy in the news literally every day. People hear about, everyone was talking about Cambridge Analytica. Right? Like this is relevant to people's lives. There's been a lot of efforts towards developing modules in conjunction with experts. There's a version of this happening at Harvard, the Embedded Ethics Program, including ethical components as part of projects. So, you know, for example, this is fairly common now in HCI classes or like user-centered design classes to like have reflections on ethics, but it doesn't have to be just the one class where we care about people. Hopefully we care about people in all our classes. Using real world data sets. So, you know, if you're teaching some concept and like, you've got a data set that's like, I don't know, stock market prices or whatever, like you could probably do the same thing with like police data, you know, the kind of thing that will inherently bring up ethical issues. And then recontextualizing existing assignments to include ethical components. So that's what I've been doing recently, and also starting at the beginning. So I've been working with introductory programming classes at CU as part of this initiative, the Responsible Computer Science Challenge. And we took existing assignments and just, you know, instead of this assignment about conditionals being about whatever it was before, now it's about personalized ads. You know, if this, then you show an ad for this. And it tees up a conversation about privacy, predictive inference, and Cambridge Analytica. Another assignment is about college admissions algorithms, for example. And if you need ideas for this, I crowdsourced a giant collection of tech ethics syllabi that is openly editable as well, if any of you have classes that you would like to add to the syllabus. And also, my students and I did an analysis of a large number of these syllabi in order to look at the topics that are being taught, with the idea in part that some of these things, instead of being just in standalone classes, could be integrated into technical classes as well. And so this paper also has a sort of current state of the art of ethics education. All right, so now I'm going to leave you with some things to remember. Again, if you had to come away from this with something that I had an impact on, one, data is people. I mean, even arguably data that isn't directly created by people, like, I don't know, like if you're doing work with like climate change data, the findings from that have an impact on people. But definitely, like tweets are not just data, for example. Also, ethical consideration should be first, not last. Early and often, I like to think about when it comes to ethics. No one is just an engineer. Everyone who is working with researching, building technology should be thinking about ethics, even if they're only thinking about it enough to know like when they need to call in an expert, right? So like there's a guy whose job at the construction site is to be a safety engineer, but that doesn't mean that the person putting up the drywall is like, oh, there's a live wire. Well, the safety engineer has to, think about that. And then finally, that education in computing should be based on all three of these things. All right. So my usual slide that says none of this work could be done without people who give me money and all of my excellent graduate students. So I would love to talk more if you all have some questions. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. So much to think about. If people have questions, you can raise your little virtual hands in Zoom or write a question into the chat. Don't be shy. They're shy.
Hey, Casey. Thank you so much for sharing this. I kind of felt like being at Complex Systems, we like encounter a lot of these stories. So I sort of felt like, I would be familiar with most of them, but a lot of the things that you shared, I had never seen before. I'm curious how these stories come to you, like in your work at the Internet Rules Lab. Do people start sending you these things all the time? Do you have like a flag for them? You can like stay on top of all of the horrible uses of technology that we're seeing nowadays.
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, sometimes people do point things to me. I also I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and my sort of Twitter ecosystem is like a bunch of tech ethicists. So I hear about a lot of things that way. The other thing is, and I actually think that this could be a fun assignment for basically any class, but definitely for like an ethics class. So my students have to give me a news article once a week. And this, I do this because actually it's great for me to be able to see not just what is out there, because I have then 40 people looking for me, but also the things that they find interesting. So for example, like 1 week at the beginning of the semester, I got like 10 articles about TikTok. And I was like, okay, we'll talk about this in class. And I also put everything they find, I put it in a spreadsheet and share it on Twitter, so, to give other people ideas as well. I also have, a lot of the things that I do a lot of work on research ethics, and right now I'm working on this giant analysis of like every paper that's been written using Reddit data with a bunch of people. And like, boy, do I have a bunch more case studies now from doing that. Like you would not believe how many papers there are that are just like, we built a classifier for X, where X is like very private things about people that people might talk about on Reddit, right?
Wow. So there's a question in the chat. So Ethan asks, how does age seem to affect user expectations of privacy or likelihood of bad actors?
So I don't know that I have like an empirical answer to this question. For privacy in particular, there's, there's this idea that like young people don't care as much about their privacy. I think that to some extent has been empirically debunked, because there's a different, like, I post a lot on social media. It doesn't mean that you don't care about your privacy, right? It doesn't mean that you're not thinking about what you're posting. Like I'm a good example of that. So I do think that there's been some studies that show that there might be more of a sense of learned helplessness in terms of privacy for younger people, in part because just sort of growing up with like, oh, everything's kind of out there. For bad actors, I actually don't know the answer to that question in terms of how age affects it. I don't know. I would say that like just anecdotally, I see sort of equal numbers of younger people who either are way more optimistic about technology than I think they should be, or like way too pessimistic. I actually think, for example, like, I don't know how many of you watched The Social Dilemma on Netflix. I had two big problems with The Social Dilemma. One is that it was 15 minutes into it before a woman said anything but her name. And the other issue I had with it is I thought that it was too negative. I mean, social media actually does some amazing things, and you have to be able to weigh that. So I don't actually have an answer to your question, but hopefully that was interesting.
Randall, I think you're next.
Thanks. Thank you for the talk. It was great. So suppose we accept that, so one of the kind of key lessons is all computer scientists should be kind of educated in various ethical principles, and also, right, so it should be something that's kind of separable from the rest of computer science education. And we can't just get all of our guidance on kind of ethical matters just from the TOSs. We can't get those just from IRB. We can't get those from the law. Okay, so then the question becomes kind of, should there be some kind of, do you think that there should be some kind of top-down ethical framework, which people are being taught to say, like, this is how to answer some of these downstream questions that you're going to get? It's like, here's a framework, it's a useful framework, here's why it's a useful framework. Or is it just you're just kind of building up these kind of ad hoc issues that people kind of identify at some point and say, yeah, like, so we recognize this is a problem, here's a solution we found to that, so just think about this next time, here's another problem, think about this next time, right? Like, are we just kind of aggregating all of these individual issues that come up across different, very disparate sections of kind of tech and ethics, and just saying, yeah, like, here's a solution we found before? Or do you think that part of the education should be like imposing this top-down structured framework of how to think about ethics on these students?
Yes, that, I think that parts of that is like the $1 million question here. So for example, the ACM has a code of ethics. It was recently revised in 2018 for the first time since 1992. like computer scientists were operating with a code of ethics that was written like before the internet was much of a thing. There are these kinds of codes of ethics that exist. And the ACM one I think is pretty good. If you want to sort of suggest something for some principles. I'm not a fan of using like traditional ethical theories as actual, like, I teach what utilitarianism utilitarianism and deontology and those kinds of things are, mostly because I think it's useful for students to see that you can approach the same problem with a different ethical framework and come to different answers. But I definitely don't want to create a bunch of utilitarian computer scientists. I personally think that there's a lot of value for some of this being bottom up in terms of forming norms that seem appropriate for the community. But I actually think that probably the right solution is to kind of meet somewhere in the middle. The problem is that we don't really have like, you know, really stringent frameworks that like, you know, like the ACM Code of Ethics is kind of the best thing that I can think of, sort of, if you want to do that. But even then, I think there are parts of it that are, you know, would not apply to every situation. For me, ethical guidelines are actually more about knowing the right questions to ask. I always think that like you are really you're really far, you know, in the right direction if you're asking the right questions and thinking about it. And ethics is a really difficult thing to teach and to think about because there aren't right answers. And even, you know, all the things that I suggested about like things you might want to think about in terms of research ethics and how you're using public data, like none of it was like a do this, do this, do this. It's sort of like, think about these things. And I also think that the more that we're talking about this in different research communities, the better we'll be able to sort of form those bottom-up norms. But yeah, that's a really hard question.
Chris.
Really enjoyed your talk. I was just, as you were talking and going through all of the sort of the landmines that have gone off in the last decade, looking at work like this, I was just thinking of all the times that we've, in our group, just talked about the ways that this data could be used poorly, and then decided not to write that paper. And how all of those conversations happen, and they happen behind closed doors largely, or they have. And so when in 2011 we sat down and said, hey, wouldn't it be fun to look at all the tweets that people delete and figure out what, you know, what are the characteristics of those messages? And then we said, you know, actually, that's really not going to be good for those people, and let's not do it. And those sorts of conversations happen all over the place. And then the bar basically just goes down and down and down until somebody says, oh, you know what, I can do it. So it's kind of, the game is kind of rigged to produce, you know, a cascading sequence of results that make it much harder for us to do what we want to do. And I'm just curious what you think about that structure that maybe would reward the less ethical among us.
Oh, that's a great point. Because you know, other people did that paper. I've seen them. Yeah, so that's actually, you know, that's a great point. And this actually goes back to the point that like, we're not talking about this enough, right? So I'm on the research ethics committee for SIGCHI, the ACM SIG for human computer interaction. And one of the things that we do is if ethical issues come up during the review process, we provide an objective opinion. We don't tell them whether to reject, or we're just like say, here's the ethic, and we'll, you know, a few of us will look at it and say, here's what we think is going on. 9 times out of 10, that discussion ends with they need to add an ethical consideration section to their paper. Like that is the most common outcome. And like I said before, I think that like that's not happening enough either. Because, you know, someone might like, maybe you know, like let's say that you had decided to do the deleted tweets thing and you had like a discussion about like, well, here's, you know, why we think this is okay. And we did this thing to like make sure that it, you know, I don't want to blame page limits on things, but like, but you know, that like adding that to papers is really useful. I have written papers where I use public data. I've done several papers where my data set is comments on news articles. And I have like, in all of these papers, there's like a lengthy ethical considerations section where I said, people like they didn't know that they were talking to researchers, but their expectations of privacy, they knew that they were talking to the entire audience of the New York Times. They were weighing in on this issue specifically. We specifically did not include any quotes that could have been considered sensitive in any way, those sorts of things. And so I think that really helps. Just talking about these things more. But I mean, the problem of like the people who decide to be unethical get their papers published is definitely an issue. Except I more often now see people getting called out. I don't like that to happen in really like negative ways. I worry about that a lot, particularly if it's like graduate students. Some things are happening in the review process. I mean, actually, an example of this recently, I called out something on Twitter without even pointing to the paper or the authors and just saying, hey, I saw this thing, had to do with the Reddit data. Turns out one of the authors, like the people who created that data set, follows me on Twitter, and they direct messaged me and were like, we had not thought about it this way before. We decided to take down the data set. And I said, that is wonderful. For someone like you, actually, like, if you talked about this publicly and like why you made that decision, like that would actually be way more influential than like me, the buzzkill ethicist, talking about it, right? So I actually think that like people who don't do work in the ethics space, like making these kinds of decisions and then talking about it could be really helpful.
Peter, I think you're next.
Hi, Casey, that was fantastic. Just very separately, I'd love to talk about fandom, but because okay. But so I've worked with Chris, who just asked that question, and I guess I want to say that I spent time in the social sciences sort of explicitly, and the IRB part was there, but it was early enough that they didn't know what the internet was, right? So we kind of had to help and kind of work with them to adapt. This is 20 years ago now, but so it's been kind of interesting to see that process. I would say it's been kind of horrifying to watch what's happened in CS, sort of coming from that mixed social science tech background. And a thing that really sort of delineated for me was the Facebook Contagion experiment, where it was horrifying to me, but I really saw in the community around me, the social scientists were really up in arms. The data scientists were just like, this is totally fine. Like, why is everyone complaining? And it was really stark. Anyway, but we've talked about these physicists and chemists, they've all seen the sort of the havocs that's been wrought by the knowledge they've produced, and they've responded. Computer science is sort of really struggling here. I would say that, Chris mentioned some of the codes we have, but the idea that you would put someone's tweet in a paper or any, what I'm trying to get to is a lot of stuff just carries over from what social scientists have figured out. Like, don't allow an individual to be identified, and that seems pretty transparent. So I just wonder, like, what do the social sciences not have? If we just sort of wholesale take IRB that kind of ethical code across, like, what's missing? How does it? Because everything's being merged together, of course. But it's such a good foundation to start with, and it's based on terrible things that have happened in the past.
So lots of interesting stuff in that question. I think that like part of it there is sort of like why did social scientists get this and computer scientists didn't, right? And I think one answer to that is that I really think that a lot of people legitimately aren't thinking of tweets as people at all. Like, this is just data. It's data in the same way that weather data is data. And I think that that's just a perception that needs to change. I mean, in the emotional contagion study is an interesting example. I actually, one of my papers about comments on news articles was about understanding how people reacted to that study. That study was actually like the thing that started a research ethics renaissance in the social computing community. Right after that is when I was a PhD student, and I organized the first of that series of ethics workshops, and like Jeff Hancock, who was one of the authors on that paper, was there. It really, I think, just had people thinking about things in a way that they hadn't before. So yeah, I mean, as I said before, I don't think that the solution here is that we should be getting informed consent. But there's some very good ideas from social science that that we should absolutely be using, like ethical fabrication, right? Like if you need to use tweets, then like tweak them a little bit. Or, something that I've done before is like, if you're going to use content that's online somewhere, make sure that it's not Googleable, and make sure that it doesn't include anything sensitive, and that sort of thing. But I really think that this underlying issue is, are you coming out of a field where you're working with people, or are you coming out of a field where you're working with data? And that determines what something like a tweet looks like to you, and how you think it should be treated. Which is why I really like giving this talk to computer scientists.
We have a question in the chat asking how you could use data ethics to inform sort of searching for a job in tech. So how some advice on how to sort of find jobs in tech and also care about data ethics.
I love that question. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about and don't have good answers for. Like, one of my graduate students and I have talked about doing some work with with CS graduates who are on the job market to see how they think about these things. So this is something that I have asked before. So like, I've been in lots of rooms with people who are talking about CS ethics education. And something that I have brought up before is like, okay, let's say that we do our jobs and we produce the most ethical computer science graduates ever. And then they go off and work at, name whatever big tech company you think is the most unethical today. What do they do? Like, should we be talking about things like how to speak to power and how to organize? And I absolutely think that's part of the conversation. Though when I brought this up once, someone gave me an interesting point, which is that the job market for like programmers, for example, is pretty good. In terms of professions where like you're probably going to have your pick of a few different places to work, programmers are in demand. And so that does mean that you can make some choices based on how you perceive the ethics of the company, which is something that you can ask about in a job interview or, ask around about, et cetera. I mean, the same way that like, if you're a woman applying for a tech job, you want to like find out if it's, if it's like an environment with lots of sexual harassment or that kind of thing. And I think that this is more common. I also think I would like to encourage people to do that, to ask those kinds of questions, because also if tech companies start thinking that they cannot hire the best talent because they're perceived as being unethical, that could also change their practices. I hope. I don't know. Yeah.
Let's hope so. So the next question on the chat is very related to this. So they're asking, how do you stand up for ethics in the workplace, especially if you're kind of at the lower level or at a lower status? So how do you voice your concerns?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I had a good answer for you. I mean, I suppose what I just said is a little bit of optimism. Like, I do think that, a lot of people who work at tech companies are in a position where if it did go badly, one could find another job pretty easily, which sort of changes the calculus a little bit, right? Of course, that's not going to be true for everyone. And if you're not in that position, then this kind of thing can be very scary. I mean, I feel like a lot of organizing that we've seen, so we've certainly seen this for Google. There has been some lesser kinds of things happening at Facebook, but in those cases, there tends to be someone who's closer to the top, who's kind of, I hope, acting maybe a little bit as like a, you know, a protection for people under, I mean, I'm thinking of people like Meredith Whittaker, which, you know, I guess that didn't, I mean, I think it turned out well for her in the end. Yeah, I mean, that is a really hard problem. And it's something that I wish I had better answers to.
I think that was our last question. Maybe I'll ask a question. So I've been thinking a lot about like the IRB, and when it comes to actually like using data, most of the times it's like we're not really even going through a sort of an ethical review. It's more like we're getting a IRB waiver. Like, what are some ways that you think that we could reform sort of the process and how we review sort of data practices in academia?
So some of my collaborators are doing work directly on this. So, so one of the things that I had on my funding slide was PERVADE, which stands for Pervasive Data Ethics for Computational Research, and it's a big group of us who have been doing work on this, like how do we think about this public data thing in research ethics? I have not been doing work about IRBs, but some of them have, and they've been like interviewing people at IRBs and holding workshops and these sorts of things. So there's a couple of papers that they published about this. And one of the things is like, there are people at IRBs who like want to be dealing with this, but don't quite know how. And so I do think that there's some movement towards this. But the other thing is that IRBs are vastly inconsistent in how they handle everything, to be honest, but in particular this. So for example, I know some people where their IRB says, oh, you're collecting tweets, like that does not involve us. Why are you like they don't want to know about it at all. There are some places where they want you to submit, you know, a thing, and then they say, okay, now we think this doesn't, you know, we don't care about this at all.
Right.
I do think that it would, I mean, the other really important thing here, because I guess I didn't say this explicitly, like IRBs are not actually about ethics. IRBs are about compliance. So I actually like, IRBs are good for like making sure that people aren't doing really unethical things. Like, I mean, IRBs are great for like medical research and like don't stick people with needles without their consent. but like they're not, you know, they're not doing this sort of nuanced ethical analysis that I think researchers should be doing. So I would like to see more soul searching and less speculation, I guess.
I agree. That's a good place to end, I think. More soul searching. Well, thank you so much. This was awesome, and it was a really nice discussion. I think everybody had a really good time. It's nice to bring everybody together when we sort of haven't seen each other in person for a really long time. So thank you for being our excuse to be together.
Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Awkward Zoom clap. All right, everybody. We'll see you next week to hear some quantum entanglement lecture.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye, Casey.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you. That was really fun. You're welcome to tell if anyone you know, wants to email me or whatever. They're more than welcome to.
I will, and I'll send you a copy of the recording so you can look at it and.
Sure. This is making, like I said, this is like I think the third time that I've given basically this is exact talk. I don't know. I think maybe I need to do a YouTube version of this talk.
Oh, that would be
yeah.
Awesome.
Well, thank you again for inviting me.
Yeah, good to see you.
All right, bye.
Bye.